Well, hello there and welcome to this, the 9th in our series of P2 webinars. And this one is one that's particularly close to the heart of everything we do here at P2 Consulting, program planning. And we're joined with a real master of the craft, Andy Willis. So it should be a really good half hour. But before we kick in, let me go through the ground rules for anyone who's new to our webinar series. We'll be talking for about 30 minutes. After the session, we'll be sending you out the presentation and the recording. So do feel free to share that with anyone you think might find it of interest. We don't unfortunately have time for questions, but please do ask them, because we always do come back after the session to answer questions when and where they have been asked. So if I can, I'll give a very quick introduction to P2 Consulting for those who haven't joined us before. We are the industry-leading digital transformation house, formed about 7 years ago to offer a real alternative to the Big Four. We're the transformation partner of choice for many of the biggest names in retail and finance and on the high street. And we do this by continuously committing to our 3 P2 promises: to improve, to control, and to deliver on our clients' transformation goals. Today, of course, we'll be talking about a very specific service, the service of program planning, which is something that we do in pretty much every single engagement we get involved in. So it's something we certainly pride ourselves on. My name is Adam Skinner. I'm the Director of Consulting here at P2 Consulting, and I'm joined by Andy Willis. Andy, do you want to introduce yourself?
Thanks, Adam. Yeah. So I've been around within P2 for a number of years and its previous guises of PIPC. I've led planning on a number of large flow programs, including Lloyds Banking Group, the ONS, HMRC, amongst others. It is one of the things that is core to me and one of the things that I really enjoy. But that said, having moved on into an agile world, there are plenty of aspects of agile that I equally enjoy now, including the planning side of it. So, but we'll come to that when we get through the presentation.
Great stuff. Thanks, Andy. Thanks very much. So, why do we plan? Well, planning is the absolute heart of pretty much all business activity, particularly critical when managing change, being involved in change. And whatever methodology you're trying to adopt, planning sits at the absolute heart of it. Something I also point out at this point: planning is both a verb and a noun, of course. The act of planning, the act of building those plans, creates a lot of that alignment and is just as critical often as the plan that results. And of course, a plan is far more than just a Gantt chart. The plan is the work breakdown structure, it's the resourcing model, it's all the stuff that goes around mapping out the future. So planning, a verb and a noun, is so critical to everything you have to do in the world of change and project management. And of course, when you go old school, when you look at waterfall planning, you have a model like this. This is the P2 framework that we use time and again to help get some control around the journey that our projects and our programs go through. Andy's going to do a deep dive into this shortly, but I think it's worth having a look at this, and it's actually pointing out that for most of our programs, waterfall activity goes through the same steps time and time again. And it's so much more detail, so much more going on than just establishing a series of milestones. Of course, waterfall is not the only game in town. Agile is playing a more and more of a role in change management. But Agile, just because it has a different approach, it doesn't mean you aren't planning. In many ways, what you have to do in Agile requires far more discipline than the waterfall world. And discipline requires frameworks. And this is the framework that we like to use in P2 to support our Agile deliveries. But enough from me. Let me hand over now to the real master. Andy, over to you.
Thanks, Adam. So let's start with kind of waterfall planning And I'm sure everybody on the call has had at least some exposure to that. Many projects and programs that are out there at the moment still actively follow a waterfall method, and Prince2, you know, as a method, product-based planning, and so on is something that is still very, very relevant in today's workplace, even with the advent and rise of Agile and other frameworks such as so. I mean, starting from the most simple of objectives in terms of what it is that we need to do to plan, we need to understand our scope, the boundary to what it is that we're doing. It defines the edges. You know, that, and typically that can include organisation, process, geographical, technical, so on and so forth. Objectives. What is it that we are aiming to do? Well, what's measurable? Have we got KPIs? All those kinds of things. Deliverables, you know, clearly define what our products are, you know, and that, as an example, that could be a portal, that could be a smartphone app, it could be a whole host of things. Outcomes, for example, you know, you could be streamlining something, we could be adding more automations to something. All of these things, you know, before we even touch a Gantt chart, before we even start to think about milestones, these are things that we need to understand that go into building a plan. The other thing that, you know, as we start the journey of planning within a project or program, just think about your planning horizon. All too often, it's too easy to go and go, I need to plan a program and I need to plan it for 3 years. And within the first 3 months, you need to try and plan something out that's 3 years in duration. Well, it doesn't really work that way. I mean, Prince2, as we all know, will help us in terms of defining stages and so on. But a sensible planning horizon, and that could be 6 months, 12 months, but certainly something that is realistic. We all know that change is inevitable in a project or program, and as we go through the life cycle, it will then result in a change to the plan. However, next thing, so we move on to products. So we all know Prince2 has a principle, focus on products. Which gives rise to product-based planning. This allows us to focus on outputs. And again, we've not talked about milestones here. We've not talked about the work breakdown structure, which we'll come to. This is a product breakdown. Product-based planning is a technique that allows us to be consistent in identifying products, identify the prerequisites, remove ambiguity, specify product requirements and quality, and so on and so forth. All of these things need to be built in order for us to understand what it is that we're doing. So product-based planning is an essential key component of, and it's an essential part of the toolkit of any planner or any project manager that's undertaking planning. You know, things such as our product descriptions, our product breakdown structure, our hierarchy of products, our product checklists, our product flow diagrams. All of those things are essential when we're starting to build our plan certainly for our projects, less so when it's programs, because it's more of an aggregation of the projects and more strategic outcomes. But either way, you know, we'd expect to kind of start with what is it that we're actually looking to try and do. So if we then move on to our next slide, how do we actually define how we deliver those products? Well, I think we should all be relatively familiar with the terminology work breakdown structure. And what the WBS allows us to do is to decompose all of those products into a smaller set of work packages, activities, tasks, all of those things that then have a capability potentially associated with them, an estimate of capacity, how many people, what skills do we require, how long do we need them for. All of those activities are essential in taking what it is that we're expecting to deliver and now get to the point where actually how are we going to deliver them. And it's really important. And again, you know, we've not started to think about necessarily the milestones and the scheduling of that. This is just purely the what, this is the how. How do we then get to what it is that we need to deliver? As we move on, we've then got scheduling of the activity. So, you know, we've created a work breakdown structure, we've got our products. What do I do next? Well, that's where we then start to break down the work breakdown structure, break down the tasks and activities, understand what our dependencies are, understand what the constraints are, sequence them, establish a critical path, make sure we do have the right resources available, and allocate them appropriately to the work packages. You know, good examples being is you've got one person allocated to several different work packages. When are they available to actually start that work? You know, they're going to be constrained by other things. It's important to understand what those constraints are, because quite often, and I've seen it on numerous occasions, a plan gets built and it's inevitably a happy path plan, and some of you may have heard the term, and it doesn't take into account constraints. It doesn't take into account the risk associated with it, and we'll touch a little bit on that in a moment. But you know, it's what we should be doing is taking a pragmatic view and a risk-based view as well. And quite often, you know, you'll find in many organisations that, you know, similar projects have been done time and time again. Learn from those as well. Have a look at the risk profile of previous projects. How well did they come in on time? Where did they actually slip up? Try and build that into the plan that you're doing. So as we move forward from our work breakdown structure, what we want to do is, as we get into the lower level of detail, we need to, as I kind of previously mentioned, challenge what we've built. So effectively, we'll be looking at the sequencing, we'll be looking at the delivery timeline. We'll really, I hate the term, but we'll kick the tires on the plan. And that's not just a planner type activity, that is absolutely a team, a project manager, key stakeholders within the project. Really go to get into a level of detail and plan and establish whether that plan is deliverable. Can we maintain the end date with what we've got, with what we know now versus what we set out to achieve in the first place? Are we still going to deliver it? Obviously, one of the key things that we need to do, and again, everyone should be familiar with the term critical path, is maintain that critical path of activity that allows us a degree of confidence that we are going to deliver to time, and maintain the outcomes that the project board or program board have set us as part of the project. One of the things we may need to do, and again, a good planner, and we'll talk a little bit about the planning role in due course, but one of the things that we should be doing is also looking at the resource allocation associated with the activity. Resource leveling, making sure we've got the right level of resources at the right time, with the right skills, with the right capability. If we don't do that, we inevitably find things don't get done, things will slip, and that's when we then start to get into the tracking and see the slippage of the milestones, potentially slippage of dependencies, and so on and so forth. As we go through this, albeit that you know, it's not one of the things we set out to achieve, we may find that we have to adjust our scope. We may find that our original intentions to deliver X by a certain point in time, given what we now know as we've gone through the planning cycle, is not achievable. Yeah, and it could well be that we need to kind of revisit the scope of that, either decrease it, or we may find that the scope as originally set out isn't going to achieve what we wanted. So just bear that in mind. Of course, once we do start to revisit areas such as scope, we need to consider how we maintain our confidence in delivery, and we go through things like change control and configuration management and so on and so forth. I mentioned it previously, but consider the risk profiles of previous projects. We've all individually worked on projects where things have slipped. We all see the signs of things slipping, you know, and that could be early warning of challenges through reports. That could be risks not being mitigated. That could be issues arising. All of those types of things raise the risk profile or impact the risk profile of a project. Don't ignore them. You know, make sure that they are being taken into consideration, because projects will live and die through the smallest of details, and quite often it's the smallest things that trip you up. And I've been on several where you know, everybody's been confident in something being delivered until the last minute when it goes wrong, and all of a sudden there's no plan B. So you know, that's the type of thing that we need to be considering. One of the other things, as we kind of move to the next slide, is all around plan ownership. It's absolutely key that as we create our plan and get it out there and get it socialised, people need to own the plan. You need to have those that are accountable for it, project manager, program director, whatever, but also those that are responsible for certain aspects of it. You know, and as I've said there, you know, you could effectively have multiple resources in the plan that own their different parts of the plan. You know, it could be a development manager, it could be a business analyst, it could be a test manager. Ultimately, it may well be the project manager who has the accountability for the project board. It could be the program manager. One of the things that is important is to make sure that we've got a clear, and I use this quite a lot, using RACI. Get it out there, get it agreed, get people buying into it. And again, I've seen on numerous occasions where people create a RACI at the start of a project and it's not followed, and therefore people then start to shy away from, well, that's not my milestone, that's not my responsibility, I'm not delivering that. And all of a sudden you find you have grey areas in the plan that nobody's taking responsibility to deliver it. That then inevitably leads to consequence. And quite often will lead to a threat to the delivery of the plan. So it's important that plan ownership is recognised early and that people continually revisit that and make sure that as things move, we've got the right people looking after and delivering against the plan. So we've got a plan, we've got a schedule. What do we do next? So it's important that we baseline the plan. You know, again, I'm sure we've all done it. We've been into projects where a plan hasn't been baselined, and essentially what you have is a number of milestones or tasks or activities that are just about as fluid as they can be. And you know, without having that baseline, without having that accurate reference point to say we're going to deliver this by this particular point in time, your plan almost becomes worthless. You know, baselining is really important. It gives us not only that reference point for what we're delivering now, but it also gives us estimate accuracy. So kind of, you know, moving forward, we'll know when we started something, we'll know what we originally, how long it originally intended to take, but also how long it actually did take. And they are all learnings that then can be fed back into planning processes for other projects and programs, which gives us then, you know, some form of performance assessment, which again is important. And one of the things that that we need to do is continually learn from this, and we'll touch a little bit on this on the agile side of things. Quite often in our kind of waterfall world, and it's not always the case, but you know, learnings tend to be kind of shoved to the back of the stage or phase, or even the back of a project, and that's fine. But actually, you want to get them up front, and actually by kind of having, you know, and certainly in the planning side of things, having an accurate baseline, understanding what we said we were going to set out to achieve, understanding what our original estimates were, and revisiting that, and just making sure it's still accurate, making sure that, you know, it's still deliverable. That's really important, and I think it's those kind of things that, you know, we need to. Sorry, interruption from a grandchild there, who's now coming out the door. Yeah, so those are the kinds of things that are really important in terms of baselining our schedule. Sorry, we can then move on. So we've got a schedule. We've got a schedule that's agreed. We've got a schedule that is owned, hopefully. What do we then do? That it? No, it isn't. Clearly, as we go through the life cycle of a plan, we need to maintain that schedule. We need to maintain the quality of the quality and the content. We need to maintain the baseline. We need to report on it. We need to make sure we're managing its risks. We're managing the dependencies. We need to make sure we have appropriate governance, appropriate oversight, so that if there are challenges to it, we've got the right stakeholders behind us that understand exactly what it is that we're trying to do, exactly where the problems are, and can support us in addressing those issues. So it's important that, it's all very well building a plan and getting, a Gantt chart in Microsoft Project as an example, unless you have the underpinning processes and controls that sit around that. Again, you'll find that your plan will rapidly fall potentially out of control. So again, it's one of those things that is important as we set this up. One of the kind of key areas, and moving on to the next slide, that is important, certainly from my perspective, having been a planner for many years, and not all projects will have planners on them, and I'm the first one to admit, if you have a very small project with a relatively small team and a relatively small timescale, it is quite often, if you've got a project manager that kind of understands the planning control, they are more than capable should be more than capable of developing a plan, going through all the stages that we've been through, maintaining a schedule and maintaining control around that schedule. However, as you then kind of move beyond that into projects with additional complexity, multiple work streams or program planning, it's quite often that you will have a dedicated planner on the team. And that planner is a mixture of things, and rather tongue-in-cheek, the three characters that I've got up there, that there's the technical wizardry, which is kind of fiddling with Excel and kind of Microsoft Project and doing all the kind of technical aspects to make sure we get the right content, the right data, and we understand what it's telling us. There's the leadership bit, which is actually, I do need to speak to the delivery leads. I do need to speak to the PMO lead or the program director. I will need to kind of drive some of these aspects along. It is not a passive role. It is very much a good planner will lead the team through the planning life cycle, and a good plan will never help you towards success of delivery. But that said, there's also the art of diplomacy that sits there as well, and quite often you need to work closely with people that are feeling either challenged or they are not necessarily willing to kind of buy into the approach that you're adopting or the approach that you're proposing. So again, there's an aspect which is working closely with them, being diplomatic at the right times, providing that support to them so that they do come on board. And a good planner kind of brings all of that activity together. And a statement I've got here is they're the voice of reason and insight. And one of the things that they do need to do is just make sure they do need to maintain a degree of independence. They are part of the PMO, but at the same time, they should also be establishing where they're seeing things go wrong, the right conversations are having with, the PMO leads, program manager, program director, even if it does mean calling out or focusing on areas that perhaps delivery leads are less than comfortable with, and that is part of the role of a planner. So that's kind of waterfall. So as we move into agile, let's kind of talk a little bit about planning in agile. Well, I've heard it many times, and certainly as I've moved more into the agile space over the course of the last few years, when it's agile, we don't plan. Well, that's not true. That's strictly not true. There are absolutely aspects of planning in agile that are essential, not least of which high-level planning up front. Now, this may not have, and we'll touch on this in a minute, this may not have a dedicated planner to it, and we'll discuss the reason why it's not going to have a dedicated planner to it. But we still need to know when we start, we still need to know when we finish, we still need to understand what our time box schedule is, potentially our planning iterations if we've got large agile at scale, or we're part of a program or a release train or whatever it might be. So you can see that there are definitely planning aspects to what we are doing in agile, and it's important that we recognize that. Agile just doesn't happen by itself. Agile happens having a plan running alongside it. It's not a plan that you would necessarily see all of the aspects of waterfall within, but it certainly has a number of the aspects of kind of waterfall planning within it as well. So where's the planner in an agile world? Well, actually, there isn't one. Sorry, can we just move on to the next slide? Over? Thank you. As we may be aware, lots of folks I suspect are probably aware, in our agile world, we have a team, and our teams will include, I'll just give you an example of some of the roles that sit within the teams: business analysts, solution developers, solution testers, business ambassadors, and so on and so forth. There isn't a planner role per se within the agile world. Some of the aspects of planning, certainly coordination of the planning activity, potentially coordination and planning of planning iterations, are undertaken by the team leader or the scrum master. But actually, on a broader basis, it's the team responsible for planning. And it's not that we're responsible for planning specific kind of milestones. Inevitably, there will be milestones and dependencies within any agile project plan. But when you've got a series of time boxes or sprints that are kind of every 2 weeks, the focus is less about milestone tracking and more about actually the delivery of the scope. It's about scope management. It's about velocity tracking, points tracking by the team. And we'll come to a little bit of that in a moment. So what does our agile planning approach look like? And I've tried to do here on the next slide a very simple set of activities that, and I won't go into detail underneath, but a very simple set of activities that we would expect to cover within an agile plan. As I previously stated, a high-level plan, and quite often that plan will be set up at the outset, and you may not even have a team in place at that point in time. But a project manager who's associated with the project is highly likely to create and set up that plan. And again, it's very simple. You may not even have a Gantt chart associated with it because of its simplicity. Start, ends, program increments, time box planning, the initial scope into the first 1 or 2 time boxes. We start to get into a little bit more complexity and detail once we get into the program increments. And I've used some of the terminology from Agile scaling from site here. But if you've looked at scaling of Agile, which requires a planning or a program increment roughly every 10 to 12 weeks, you're going to be looking at things like any changes to business context, any changes to the roadmap, any changes to the features. You're going to be planning for all of that. You're going to be looking at the scope of what the teams can agree. And I've got kind of looked at the writing underneath the chevrons. There's a whole series of activities that relate to planning. Now, a lot of people will say we don't need to plan, as I said previously in Agile. Well, you do, and you can see these are exactly the types of activities that need to happen as you plan out your Agile project. Our next page gives us a little bit more detail on that. And again, I talked about the high-level plan. I talked about the time box plan, and we've all kind of heard of sprints, or hopefully all heard of sprints. Typically 2 to 4 weeks. Typically a team of somewhere between 8, maybe 10, 11 type people, and a scope associated, agreed by the team, what it is that they can actually do during that period of time. So at the end of it, we'll get some value, but the team itself will then determine what it is that's going to be delivered based upon what the product owner is looking for as well. So the product owner will have to support the prioritization of that activity. Then you've got, as I mentioned previously, the planning and program increments. Again, once every roughly 3 months, so perhaps 3 to 4 a year, something like that. Again, when you're scaling Agile, these are important events. This is where multiple teams will start to come together, draw dependencies between them. So again, we talked about dependencies in the waterfall world, but absolutely have dependencies in an Agile world as well. We absolutely start to look at our capacity. We'll look at our resources. We'll look at our cross-functional teams. Well, at the end of that program increment planning, we'll have a program book, which essentially is the plan for the next 3 months, and it will have feature deliveries on that. The other area, and again, we've all kind of seen schedule events type planning within a waterfall world. It's when we kind of implement release. If we are, again, we will always deploy stuff within an agile delivery. And again, we'll need to think about our deployment planning, our release planning. Quite often that will be via DevOps, and it's just a continual stream of development and delivery. Quite often it won't be. There may not be DevOps type environments there, and we'll be planning for features to be delivered or scope to be delivered at a certain point in time. The one thing that is interesting at that point, things such as change management, impacts to the business, that's all activity that needs to be considered. So it isn't just a technical change, it's not just a system update, but actually are there processes to be changed at the same time? If so, what's the training that needs to happen alongside of that? So we talked an awful lot about scope and the various ceremonies and events that need to take place. As we move on, do we still track our milestones? Well, yes and no. There are certainly some key activities, key milestones that any agile project will want to track, and they could be dependencies. That could be a market event. It could be something that plays into the space that the agile project is working in, and they're important to track those. But the reality is, if we've got a defined set of sprints or time boxes over an agreed period of time, the value in actually tracking those sprints and the completion of those sprints is not huge. Actually, the value comes in tracking the scope and the value that comes out of that. What's being delivered? Is it what we said we were going to deliver in the first place? So in a way, it's much less about tracking milestones that we've done from a waterfall perspective and the schedule we've created there, and much more about tracking our value, about completion of things like user stories, potentially completion of our epics, our velocity tracking through the sprints themselves. What's impacted that? Are we on target? Are we off target? Etc. Etc. So there's elements of both that absolutely sit within an agile world, but as I said, and as you can see, it's far less about kind of layers of detail at the milestone level within an agile world, and much more about kind of scope and epics and user stories and velocity and so on and so forth. One of the things that's quite interesting here is that we've been working on, just as an aside, there are some tools out there now that allow us, and perhaps many of you would have heard of Jira. Jira has never been brilliant at kind of all of the reporting that you need. There are some tools now that allow us to kind of interface directly into Jira and get some kind of real-time tracking going, which gives us the things like the burn down charts and so on. And a lot of times, certainly on projects that I've worked on previously, it's been kind of extract the data, put it into Excel and so on. So there are tools out there that allow us to do that on a real-time basis and present a different type of view depending upon your role within the project or stakeholder group, which is quite interesting and allows you to give confidence to those that exist within and also outside of the immediate project that we are tracking to progress. So that's it. That's pretty much a whistle-stop tour. And I apologise for going slightly over. Adam, I'll hand over to you, and you're going to talk about roadmap planning.
Thanks, Andy. Yeah, I'll just take a couple of minutes, if I may, to talk about roadmap planning, because it's such a critical aspect of any program delivering. As we know, roadmaps are really views of the future. They're usually over a 1 to 3 year horizon, but they're far more than just a higher level iteration of the plan, an iteration of the plan stripped down to 10 milestones or whatever. The roadmap is an absolutely critical link between the organizational strategy and the delivery of priorities of that program. And it's designed primarily not for the people within the project. They tend to be using these specific plans that have been created, the Gantt charts and the like. It's almost always most powerful as a tool for telling a story to stakeholders who aren't intimately involved in the project or program. And as such, it needs to do something very different to what the plan does. It's not just about laying out 10 milestones. It is essentially about telling a story. It needs to tell a story about what the future may look like through this transformation that stakeholders can grab hold of, and also the stakeholders can get excited about. One of the things I quite like to do is talk about what you can learn from the rules for writing a story and how that helps one design the narrative of a roadmap. And I really have 6 here. So number 1 is understand the plot, not the story of your program. A story is 2 men have an argument. A plot is 2 men have an argument because one has crashed into the other's car. Yeah, there's a because in there. There's reasons and there's relationships. Start with the ending, work backwards. It helps you focus on the vision. In a story, you're identifying the main characters, trying to show the transformation those characters go through. It's exactly the same in a roadmap. You need to think about the parts of the organization. They are essentially the characters in your transformation. You need to think about the parts of the organization and what is happening to them. That's linked to point 4, which is how do you make that relatable to the stakeholders who will be reviewing and seeing this thing? How do you make sure that roadmap they are seeing relates to them, their world, and the changes to their world? Again, it's really important that you're focusing on the business and what's happening to the business. Avoid excessive exposition. You know, when you're writing a good book, it needs to be simple, clear, and flowing. Exactly the same with a roadmap. And you have to fight against that temptation to put more detail into the roadmap because actually you're excited by it. The less is more whenever you're doing one of those roadmaps, as long as you are telling the story and showing the relationship. Finally, you're not doing this for yourself. You are doing this for the stakeholders. So it's incredibly important that you get those stakeholders to read it. They will have a fundamentally different view of the world than you do because they haven't been stooped in the activity of the projects up until that point. They need to look at it. If it doesn't work for them, it doesn't work. It really is that simple. And again, as I mentioned a little bit earlier, you know, planning and road mapping, you know, they are verbs. The process of creating the roadmap is often the point. It's getting those stakeholders engaged, helping them to join you in that journey you're taking them on. So the process is so very important to get that alignment. One of the great takeaways I always find from Scaled Agile is the whole point of the PI planning activities is really about alignment, almost more than the thing you have at the end. Really important stuff. Well, that's getting very close to all the time we've got. Very quickly, our top 3 tips. You know, number 1, actually, there are a whole load of different methodologies out there. You really need to be choosing the right one for the situation you're in. Use that right framework or things are going to go wrong. Number 2, I've talked about this a lot, but actually planning is a verb. Using the team around you, get them involved, get them committed. It'll build alignment, it'll build commitment. And for number 3 is actually, we like to say, embrace the best of both worlds. There's some great stuff out there in the waterfall world and in the agile world. Don't be afraid to mix and match as long as you are really clear about the process, the journey, the artifacts, and who needs to sign off and own those documents. Well, thank you once again for joining us. You can see our details on the top left. Please do feel free to drop us any questions or link in to us if you'd like to. We're always happy to chat about the subject, as you can clearly tell. We'll be sending the presentation out to all attendees. I know a few people have asked about that. You'll also have access to this webinar, which we've recorded, so do feel free to share that with anyone you think might find it of interest. Again, do feel free to drop us questions. We'll be back in 2 weeks' time with a webinar that's actually very close to my heart, looking at the philosophy of change. We'll be looking at some of the thinkings of the great philosophers and what that means around to change in management. So if you've ever wondered what Wittgenstein would do in a steerco or where Confucius would sit in the program, please do join us for that session. So all that remains is for me to thank you for joining us and wish you a very pleasant weekend.